Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us for our second session in Mapping Your Leadership Development Journey with Sarah Drummond. For those of you who weren't with us last week, welcome back, or welcome in. For everybody who was with us last week, welcome back. And just a reminder to those of you who may have missed it or weren't with us last week, we will be sending out an email later this week with a link to the recording of today's session and Sarah's PowerPoint presentation. So if anybody has any questions or you have any technical issues, feel free to reach out to me or Megan Lukens, who's our communications coordinator. And if any questions come up for you over the course of Sarah's presentation, please just drop them in the chat to me and I will help organize those for her. And with that, Sarah, I will hand it back to you.
Well, thank you, Kelly. And again, thank you for hosting this gathering where we're talking about mapping our leadership development journey. I'm going to share my screen, so bear with me for a moment if you don't mind. And we will have some time of presentation and then some time of discussion, followed by a time of question and answer and sharing with each other. Here at our landing page, you'll see that the slides that I'm about to present from are available on Andover Newton's website right now. So if you're a person who likes to pull down a presentation and have it in front of you to jot notes in the margins, this is where you can find it, andovernewton.yale.edu. It's under Resources for Lifelong Learning. And without further ado, session 2. So for those who were able to be here or not able to be here last week, I'm going to provide a brief overview of what we talked about, because today we will build on some of that content. First, we talked about the sought after attitude of a person who has participated in this workshop. My real hope and prayer is that anyone who participates in this workshop will look with confusion or scorn at a person who asks them, why in the world does a leader need lifelong learning for leadership? You should look at them like this, because lifelong learning for leadership is normal and it's necessary. And if you're a person in a position of responsibility, what would be truly weird would be if you didn't need lifelong learning for leadership. So last week we talked about that attitude, and we also talked about a rationale for lifelong learning for leadership, particularly now. I went into great detail about why leadership is particularly complicated at this moment in our history, at this moment in our culture's shared life. And I also made the argument that not only is our leadership terrain very complicated, but it's also changing very quickly. So the complexity is expanding and its expansion is accelerating. So even just to maintain capacity for leadership, we need to really stay at the edge of our own capacities. And what I'm proposing in this series is a multi-pronged approach to leadership development that includes 3 different sorts of activities. So the sorts of activities that we talked about last week related to discovery of new content. So last week we talked about content-based learning. So content-based learning is a fancy way of saying figure stuff out by getting info, getting material, getting information. And I proposed last week that we break our information, we break content into 3 different categories. We look at what's the best theory available, like what's the best book learning available, what's the best theoretical knowledge available to us through all of our different portals for getting information. Second, I commend looking around. What are peers doing and what are peer organizations doing that's similar to the kind of content I would like to learn? And then third, I recommend consulting with those who are familiar with the topic. You'll notice I like to use the expression bone up on something. I think about the expression bone up as though my knowledge were just kind of a blob. And what I want to do is put a spine into that. I want to bone up, and I can only do that bone by bone. I argued and I argue that this work has to be intentional, methodical, and here's the hard part, impervious to distraction. Everybody we meet is going to tell us, oh, you should read this book about leadership, that book about leadership. You should listen to this podcast. You should watch this TED Talk. And they'll think nothing of the fact that they're overwhelming you, because they really are just trying to help. But because of the preponderance of information available to us, sometimes we just have to really focus in. If we want to learn about accounting, we need to focus on accounting and not get distracted by TED Talks about everything but accounting. If we want to learn about how to be a good supervisor, we need to try to block out the distractions that would have us exploring everything under the sun except for how to be a good supervisor. What I encourage you to do as we start making our way into this week's presentation is, if you have taken some time in the past week to think about on which you wish to bone up, what are some of the content areas that you would like to learn more about? I just would be really curious, and I'm sure Kelly would be too, about what kinds of things have you been thinking about, wishing that you could learn more about, especially as relates to exploring new content that's new to you as a leader. So please just bang something out in the chat. I'll be eager to hear what you say. So today's session, we're looking at a different outcome focus and a different form of lifelong learning for leadership. So last week, the outcome focus was our attitude. This week, we're going to focus on skill. Last week, it was the attitude of it is normal to want and need lifelong learning for leadership. Today, we're going to talk about the skill of how do we create healthy habits, sustainable habits, so that we're engaging in learning for leadership in a sustainable way throughout our whole lives. So we're talking about the skill of mapping our leadership development journeys. And we're going to look at the lifelong leadership learning strategy of reflective practice. How does our engagement with friends and colleagues, spiritual guides and supervisors, counselors and colleague groups constitute lifelong learning specifically for leadership? Last week it was content. Today, reflective practice. Next week, we'll look at expanding our horizons. And away we go. So let's talk first about the skill of cultivating lifelong learning. I am sure that if I were running a poll today, which I'm not doing like I did last time, thank you, Megan. If I were running a poll and I were to ask, what's the primary obstacle for you really investing in lifelong learning for leadership, I am guessing that many, if not most of you, oh dear, what happened here? Something froze. There we go. I bet many, if not most of you, would say that you know that there's just so much out there, but you just don't have the time. And I'm not here to tell you that you're lying to yourself. I bet you don't have the time. But what I'm proposing is a sustainable practice of lifelong learning for leadership. And when we want to find sustainability in something for which we technically don't have time, we have to think about what kinds of habits would make sense for us. This is true for our prayer life. This is true for our fitness. This is true for relationships that are important to us. We don't have the time, we make the time. And when we make the time, we have to do so in a way that's realistic and not self-defeating, causing us to feel like we're just not good enough to engage in lifelong learning for leadership. Now, finding time when time is scarce in order to take advantage of the abundant resources available to us, we have to overcome some obstacles. And I would dare say that it's the overcoming the obstacles that's the hard part. It's not the find the resource, find the course. Developing healthy habits is not something that we are, if we're not doing it, it might be more complicated than we're just procrastinating. So I'm naming here 3 different ways of describing the resistance we might feel to developing healthy habits for investing in our lifelong learning for leadership. The first comes from the work of Lisa Leahy and Bob Keegan, Immunity to Change. Many of you might be familiar with the work of Bob Keegan and specifically Immunity to Change. And the diagram at the bottom of the screen is a really good way for me to just give you a quick summary of what that concept is. So Bob Keegan writes about adult development, the way in which adults mature over the course of their lives. And he describes the great challenge of adulthood as managing competing commitments. There are many things that are important to us. And sometimes when we get older, we need to juggle commitments to our career with commitments to our family, with commitments to our health, and the list goes on. So the idea of immunity to change is that in order to figure out what we're doing and not doing, we have to figure out what is our competing commitment that's preventing us from embracing that which we know is in our best interest. So commitment might be, in my case, this is the example that I pull out a lot. In my case, I find it difficult to get places on time. I work really hard to get places on time. And I commit, I'm going to get to every appointment 5 minutes early so I can just relax and be really present. That's my commitment. Sometimes I do it. So we're moving now to the right in that column, the next column over. Sometimes I do it and sometimes I don't. And I really wish that I always did it, but sometimes I do it and sometimes I don't. What is therefore the competing commitment? Well, my competing commitment is usually that I can maybe squeeze in one more thing. Rather than being 5 minutes early, I could answer one more email. I could take one more pass at making sure I didn't forget anything in my bag to go to work. I can maybe knock one more thing off the list. And moving all the way to the right, in what way am I feeding that competing commitment through some assumptions that I might make? Well, in the case of being late or on time, the big assumption might be that I, Sarah Drummond, am only as worthy as how much I can get done. That which I get done is definitional to who I am. So if I can get one more thing done, I get a big thrill. And one less thing done, a little bit of shame. And so that big assumption is forming a pattern that's harder for me to break than just deciding I'm not going to be late anymore. So again, when it comes to developing healthy habits for lifelong learning for leadership, sometimes we need to identify what is the competing commitment that's preventing us from engaging in that style of learning. And when we do, we get to know ourselves better. And that's learning in and of itself. The second two categories, cognitive dissonance and the null curriculum, can be described in one grand definition. Cognitive dissonance is the way that we describe something that just doesn't compute for us. And the null curriculum describes the messages that we get from what's not there. For many people who are in leadership, they have been given impossible tasks that they don't know how to do. When they engage in impossible leadership task and they feel like they're an educated person, an experienced person, an intelligent person, and yet I don't know how to do this thing, there's a sense of dissonant confusion that emerges. It's a very uncomfortable feeling. The null curriculum tells us that lifelong learning for leadership was not important. If it wasn't in the curriculum at our school, if great leaders don't talk about how they needed to learn and grow, the absence of that message of the importance of lifelong learning for leadership, the absence becomes more important than the presence of anything else. So when you couple that sense of, I don't know how to do this, and it's actually really hard, with the null curriculum of nobody ever talks about this, or nobody ever teaches people how to do this stuff, we're left thinking that if we are feeling unprepared or feeling like the challenge that's new to us is more than we can handle, that it must be us. There must be something wrong with us. And what I'm trying to convey in a million different ways in these workshops is that this work of leadership in an emergent era is actually really hard. It's not impossible, but nobody was born knowing how to do it. If we can overcome our sense that we shouldn't have to engage in lifelong learning, then perhaps we'll be less resistant to dedicating time to it. So again, I've already talked last week about the steps we might take to bone up on something. I'm now going to be talking about the way in which reflective practice can deepen and improve our capacities to lead. And what I'm really charging you to think about when it comes to skill are how can you plot out a path that makes time for boning up on new content and engaging in reflective practice without shaming yourself for the fact that you actually do need to invest in lifelong learning for leadership. So, moving to the topic of reflective practice, the people who are on the screen who have been field education supervisors, supervised ministry supervisors, are probably familiar with this pattern of lifelong learning or the pattern of leadership learning that we call reflective practice because it is the go-to methodology for supervising interns in a variety of settings, particularly settings that are very human interaction heavy. So you can see a pattern there on the right. We move from an incident or a realization that takes place within leadership. So an incident, somebody sent me an email and told me that they thought that I was way out of line in a meeting the day before. Incident. I was driving home from that meeting and I realized I was way out of line. That's a realization. Both of them can be characterized as a topic of reflection for reflective practice. In one case, it's an email. In another case, it's an aha moment. And either are subject to our reflective practice as an intentional means of learning about them. So the leader thinks about it. The leader captures it. Sometimes the leader writes it down. I was a jerk in that meeting. Or I felt terrible when I got that email about the way this person experienced me in that meeting. We capture it and we try to capture the thickest description we can so that we might hold on to what God might have in store for us in that incident or realization. Then we engage others, and those others could take many different forms. We shine a light on the incident, not just by ourselves, but perhaps with partners, colleagues, friends. And the lights that we shine include our faith, our history, the history of our faith, our past experiences, our scripture, our spiritual meaning-making methodologies, our belief systems. We might take into account the views of others, where we sit down with somebody we trust and show the email or share the realization. We pay attention to our emotions and how our emotions might guide us toward what's really useful in this reflective time. From that engagement, we move into finding new insight and enacting that new insight. Maybe I'll behave differently in the next meeting. Maybe I will reach out to the person I offended. Maybe I won't do either of those things, but there's a third thing that I need to work on. Perhaps I went into the meeting hungry or tired, and I need to do something different before the meeting next time. But in any case, this cyclical movement from incident or realization to enactment really captures what many models of reflective practice describe. I list the kinds of, in this slide here, I list the kinds of places that we might find reflective practice partners. No, I don't. Here we go. We might begin a reflective practice with friends and colleagues, So when we engage our friends and our colleagues, we can have an intentional and sacred conversation. We begin our reflective practice by telling the truth to a trusted person or group of persons. When we tell the truth to our friends and colleagues, it becomes much harder for us to lie to ourselves. One of my mentors, Dudley Rose, used to always use that expression, tell the truth for an hour once a week, and it gets really hard to lie to yourself. The key is with a friend and a colleague with whom we might engage in reflective practice. The difference between venting and engaging in reflective practice is that we need to have utmost trust in the person we are engaging. Utmost trust because we want to be open to hearing what they have to say. If we don't believe that they love us, if we don't believe that we want, if we don't believe that they want what's best for us, we will not be open enough to hear their perspective. And their perspective is the kind of input that makes the difference between writing in a journal and engaging in reflective practice. The hope is that the friend will speak honestly and kindly. And the hope also is that this is a friend who really embraces the idea of lifelong learning for leadership. I don't know about you, but I have a particular friend who I really trust to give me a second set of eyes, ears, and a nose when I'm engaging in a reflective topic related to ministry specifically. So that's my friend Amy. And Amy is the person that I can ask questions like, I am dealing with a really difficult situation. In what way do you think that I might be making it more difficult than it needs to be? Because I trust her warmth and affection for me enough that she's going to put it nicely, but I also trust that she's going to tell me the truth. If you don't have an Amy, go find an Amy. The notion is that we all should have a folder in our email inbox that just says colleagues, and something should be going in that folder every day. And something from you to a colleague should be going out every day, because those relationships are part of our lifelong learning for leadership. We're not using people because we're trying to create a sounding board system for one another. So again, friends and colleagues are our go-to when it comes to lifelong learning for leadership through reflective practice. Second, we turn to our guides and our supervisors. The kinds of guides and supervisors that might be familiar to you, spiritual directors or spiritual accompaniment partners, therapists like psychotherapists, pastors, bosses. What makes these relationships different from a friendship or a colleagueship might be that these relationships are not necessarily mutual. It's expected that I turn to Amy, and it's expected that Amy turns to me. It just depends on the situation or the day. I would be very surprised if the chair of my board came to me with her own life problems when I go to her with my life problems related to my job. It's not a reciprocal relationship, although there's great mutual respect. The term supervision is one that's highly scrutinized. You hear the term describing the way we work with, say interns in social work, or ministers supervising seminarians. The term is correct in that it is meant to suggest a guide that's providing structure, that's providing a holding environment for reflective practice, providing a vessel or a container for reflection. But what's problematic about it is that a supervisor in the commercial world, in the work for pay kind of world, is ordinarily not focused on the mentee's learning so much as the organization's productivity. This particular form of supervision, the way we supervise reflective practice, has the objective of fostering learning in the supervisee, irrespective of what that does or does not produce for the organization. So counselors are extremely valuable to those who work in high touch, lots of people interaction kinds of fields like ministry. I've heard it said that if you're counseling others, you yourself need to be in counseling, and that this is a matter of ethics, that the alternative would be that you might actually even unknowingly seek to work out your stuff on other people if you don't have a healthy place for sharing the issues that you're in need of counseling on. Now, counseling, especially amidst leadership roles, is not a panacea. There are two limitations, and I'm sure there are many, many more, but two that I think are particularly relevant to lifelong learning for leadership. First, friendships are built over periods of years. And sometimes when a person's engaged in psychotherapeutic counseling or pastoral counseling around a crisis, they invest during that season, they invest less in their friendships and their colleague relationships because they have really expressed or expelled the negative feelings and are not in need of that sounding board that we talked about 2 slides ago of the friends and colleagues. And here's the problem, is that if you are talking with a therapist for, say, 6 months about a work-related issue or a ministry-related issue or a leadership-related issue, and then that relationship comes to an end, you don't have the continuity you might have with colleagues and friends. So, moral of the story is, just like we need to maintain our friendships when we're also pursuing an intimate partnership, we need to maintain our friendships and our colleague relationships even when we're in counseling, maybe bringing different kinds of issues, but recognizing that friendships need to be built and sustained. And then second, leadership pain is not pathology, meaning that if we feel hurt because we have been criticized or told that we have failed or told that we've been unfaithful, that's actually a very healthy and normal response. And a psychotherapeutic approach might have us thinking that there's something wrong with us for feeling that hurt. We shouldn't have let those voices that deeply in. Now, all counseling practices, all counseling experiences are different, one with the other. But I have experienced over the years that people who are in their job out of a sense of call sometimes get advice from a therapist about how to handle a leadership issue that just won't work for them. I once went to see a counselor because I was having a very difficult time at work. And I said from the beginning, you can't tell me that the only answer is going to be that I need to quit, because I can't. This is my calling and I can't. And the therapist totally got it. And we had a great relationship and I found tremendous help. But honestly, many times she said, I have to remind myself, you told me that you're not going anywhere. And I said, that's true. I'm not. And it's not because I'm self-flagellating here. It's just I'm called to this work. And it's not the same as a job where I can just write a letter of resignation. These are people. This is a ministry. This is a mission. That's a very, very deep part of who I am. The benefits far outweigh the occasional shortcomings of working with a counselor. Counseling provides us with role clarity. And even if we're working with a counselor who has no clue how to help us with our leadership crisis, we do listen ourselves into truth. And I believe that to be a sacred and spiritual practice. So colleague groups, many of you might have been part of a colleague group. I've been a part of several colleague groups over the years. And They have their benefits, and just like a counselor, they're no panacea, but they do have their benefits. So the kinds of groups I'm talking about are things like a Havruta group or a lectionary scripture study. Havruta is a word that a model that we borrow from the Jewish faith tradition, where having discussion over scripture is a way to build a friendship, a spiritual friendship. So Havruta is a spiritual friendship. Lectionary scripture studies for those who are preaching regularly are another form of colleague group. Some colleagues form a case study group. They might just form a peer group, people who are in the same field with similar responsibilities, who just share their stories and seek each other's input. So over time, I've learned about a lot of different forms of colleague groups, and here are some good practices that have emerged as ones I think that are very worthwhile. So imagine you decide that you want to form a colleague group with people in a similar role to yours in your town. I encourage you to agree to and stick with a methodology. So often that which causes a group not to be successful is that people are there for different reasons. And in the interest of free will and making people feel comfortable, they don't agree on a way that they're going to engage with each other. And they find themselves coming out of those gatherings more tired than when they went in. Second, of course, honor confidences and honor each other's time. If you're meeting for breakfast once a month, you pick what time breakfast starts and what time it ends, so that people can feel relaxed and know that they are going to be able to fit this obligation in with the other things that are important to them. And finally, I have never, ever, ever in my life heard a story about a person appreciating advice in a colleague group when they hadn't asked for that advice. So I shouldn't say no advice. I should say no unsolicited advice. And I actually do think that group dynamics are best served when advice is just off the table, that we're there together seeking understanding, not advice. Because the first thing that we tend to hear when somebody offers us advice is that they would have been able to handle this. They wouldn't be having this problem if it were them. And reflective practice is not about the they, it's about ourselves. Advice, however, does have a role in lifelong learning for leadership. You might remember, as we started, I talked about how gathering new content is really helpful. Advice falls into the content category. We reach out to an expert, we reach out to a peer who's done this before, and we get their advice. Still useful, just not to reflective practice. So you might be curious about what are the, when I say you really should pick a methodology and stick with it, what are the methodologies? I'm not going to go through these in great detail, but just suffice to say they're in the bibliography, which you'll see. Jane Vennard's prayer model is one model that has been adopted by many peer groups that are part of a faith community or a community of clergy. And it's a model where different people in the group are assigned different roles. It seems very staged, but it actually has a great reputation. I haven't experienced it personally, but a great reputation as providing a very safe space. And again, these are in the bibliography, which you'll see. Second, I've used what's called a shared wisdom model, which comes from a kind of case-based approach where people in the group take turns presenting a critical matter, take turns presenting something on which they're struggling, a critical incident. The model that I and colleagues here at Andover Newton use, we borrow from a book we talked about last week, Another Way. The book is called Another Way. And it's a very simple method where we engage in 4 steps with a group of colleagues. We create a hospitable space. We ask an affirming question. We reflect theologically, and we enact a new way. So a hospitable space could be the way we physically are comfortable. It could be one where we've had a good icebreaker, so people are feeling open. An affirming question might be something so simple as, what's the biggest challenge you faced in your ministry this week? Or it could be something more abstract, like, where do you see God at work in the world right now? We reflect theologically, we enact a new way. Very simple, easy to remember, but it's a methodology and we stick to it. So right now, what I'm going to ask Megan to do is to break you into small groups, and bear with us because we haven't done this yet for this workshop, but I think it's going to be great. And here's the guiding question. We started with content approaches. And so I encourage you to please name in your small group what content area you would just like to learn more about. Real simple question, a content area you would like to learn more about. When you get together, you'll share what areas you are wanting to learn more about, and you're going to share what obstacles are keeping you from that learning. What do you want to learn more? What obstacles might keep you from it? When we come back together, we're going to focus on the obstacles. We're going to focus on the obstacles. So please break into your groups. You'll have just 10 minutes. Let's just say, let's actually say you got 12 minutes in your small groups, and then we'll come back together. So 12 minutes in small groups, then we'll come back together, and I'll look forward to seeing you then. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. What I would encourage us to do now is, if your group arrived at a theme or themes for what might be keeping you, what might be causing you to maybe not allocate time or not pursue the learning that you've named that you're hungry for, if you came up with a theme, I would love people to start writing them in the chat. And also, if you could send any questions or discussion topics to my colleague, Kelly. Kelly is collecting questions and will feed them to me. So again, if you could write in the chat any themes, and if Kelly could feed me any questions that have gone direct message.
Okay. All right. I don't have any questions yet. I'm sure people are thinking about that, but I had a question for you, Sarah.
Kelly, go for it.
You, earlier when you were talking about counselors, you said we can listen ourselves into truth. Can you say a little bit more about what you mean about that?
Yes, that's an oft used phrase from the world of pastoral care and counseling. And I wish, if somebody knows who originally said it, please write it in the chat, because I actually don't know. But the notion is that the main purpose that we can serve for each other in a listening relationship is helping the person who we're listening to feel understood, to feel like what they're saying makes sense and is thus human, and makes us feel more connected with other human beings. So quite often, I think people talk with those who can't even respond, like they talk to their dog, or they talk to themselves in the mirror. And they do that in part because by overhearing their own words, they're providing self-understanding, the consolation that they find when they feel like this is understandable that I'm feeling sad. This is understandable that I'm feeling confused. And I know it's understandable because I'm being understood.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any questions yet, but I did want to note for you, one of the comments that came up in here from one of the groups was that new learning is not a part of identity, not enjoyable. So how can we work through that?
Hi, Nancy Lois. I love that it's Nancy who said this, because she and I have been through plenty of experiences where we had to learn things we didn't want to have to learn how to do. And I also see a comment from Jennifer about where to begin in finding new resources. So the notion that that learning and growing is not necessarily enjoyable, I think you're going to find some great relief when we start talking next time about expanding our horizons. Because so often we put off, and I'm not saying procrastinate as though there's no good reason, but we put off the work of exploring something that we don't understand or don't know how to do, in part because we feel like we should already know. And it feels good to know already. When somebody asks me a question and I don't know the answer, and then they ask again, I often say to them, I actually really love knowing the answer. So if I tell you that I don't know, it pains me. I can promise you I don't know the answer. So one of the things we'll talk about next week is how engaging in experiences that broaden our horizons help us build up a tolerance for that feeling of, I don't know, and that makes me uncomfortable. Most of us have a very low tolerance for that negative feeling of not knowing, and we have to grow in our capacity by putting ourselves in a state of unknowing intentionally and often, so we can get more used to it, because it doesn't feel good for anybody. And then as for the question about finding materials, finding resources, all of us have had the experience of being in school, in education, developing a research question or a research project. And I would say that the hardest part is not finding the resources, it's framing the question, knowing what it is that we really are wanting to know right now. Because until we can really frame the question, we don't know where to look. One of the leadership development areas that I had to really learn after school, I studied administrative leadership in my PhD program, but I never had a chance to take a class on supervision, how to be a good supervisor. I didn't have the language for even framing that question at first. I had to really talk with more experienced ministerial leaders, more experienced educational leaders, to even get to the point where I knew what to Google. So the time that we spend framing the question is well worth it.
Well, thank you for bringing that point up, because that was actually one of the things that came up in our group, right? Is that sometimes it can feel like a topic is so broad. How can you find what you're really looking for within that?
Yes.
Yeah. It's interesting. Another group listed confidence as one of the obstacles of diving into learning.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we all feel that. I certainly do.
Mm-hmm.
And then the expectation that as leaders, you're already supposed to sort of be experts at this, right? So I think that internally, we each need to do work on coming to terms with the fact that it's okay that we don't know everything,
Mm-hmm.
and being able to, figure out how we want to get started on learning more about particular topics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we had other, yeah.
I think that might be a good final comment from me before we close and look forward to seeing each other next week. When I started at the beginning talking about the null curriculum and the cognitive dissonance, I was referring specifically to that feeling of shaken confidence that we didn't already know this. We don't remember our mentors and leaders going to lifelong learning for leadership opportunities. We don't remember people talking to us when we were in school about how difficult it is to lead, for example, amidst conflict, to lead in a setting where I saw the word disengaged or siloed participants who we have been charged with drawing them in, but they don't want to be. I've said it once, I'll say it 1,000 times. Nobody was born knowing how to do it. And we get these messages that we shouldn't have to learn this. As our culture changes more and more quickly, this is going to become a less and less burdensome problem, because no leader could possibly know everything when there is just so much complexity to be known. Every context is different, Every situation calls out different kinds of knowledge that are needed. And in an emergent era, we're going to have to get much more used to answers like, I don't know. I'm going to need to learn about that. More than one thing is likely to be true at the same time for two different people in the same setting, because truth is multiplying. Complexity is multiplying. And if you're not confused by that, you are not paying attention. What I'm trying to provide are these three different approaches, the idea being that no one of them is sufficient to these times all by itself. So we've talked about content, we've talked about reflective practice. Next week, we talk about broadening our horizons, and I'll look forward to seeing you then.